Hello everyone. Recently I did a video just about options in general, and I thought I should do one about some of the basic options strategies you can take that are a little bit more close to investing rather than basically just throwing money into a slot machine and seeing if you win. Though obviously that's not fair, just the buying of options, which is what I talked about primarily before, can be an investment strategy, but it's a little bit less often to see it used as such, at least in the retail investor world, which is what you and I are. So, first, I'm going to talk about selling calls. You remember a call is the right to buy an underlying asset, blah, 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 from my previous video. If you haven't watched, you should check that out, unless you already know what options are. So, in this case, you're just selling that contract to somebody else, right? Rather than being the buyer, which is what I talked about in the previous video, you are selling it to somebody else. You're writing that contract and selling that contract. Again, it's all digital in the modern era anyway. So in this case, the thing that made you money if you were the buyer, which is if the price of the underlying asset went to the moon, now loses you money, right? You don't want it to come into the money, right? You don't want that underlying asset to get to your strike price going upwards, right? Because if it does and then starts to go beyond that, you will start losing money. And as we talked about again in the previous video, there is a break-even point that is above your strike price, depending on how much you got paid for it on day zero. So when you sell it, that's your maximum income, and from there you can basically only lose money. So if it does go up too far, the consequence of this is it'll get executed. And what that means for a call that you sold is you have to buy at market price and then sell to the price of the contract holder, whoever you sold it to, 100 shares of whatever that underlying asset is. So if you think about what that could mean, you could have something like a Tesla that went to what? It went from like $100 to $1,000 in a very short amount of time, a couple of months, 2, 3, 4 months or something. What that means is if you had sold a $110 call to somebody with an expiration date of 6 months out and they held on to that, you have an enormous loss because you have to buy 100 shares at that hypothetical $1,000 price and sell them to this person for $100, $110. So you lose a huge amount of money. But theoretically, your maximum loss is infinite because Tesla, instead of going to $1,000, could have gone to $10,000 or $100,000 or $1 million, or we could have bankrupted the U.S. Treasury or whatever, right? It could have gone to the moon. So your maximum loss when you're doing these unprotected is infinite, and most brokerages won't let just like a regular person do this because if you lose enough money, you'll just file for bankruptcy, and then the brokerage is responsible for covering it with their clearinghouse, I think is how that works. I'm not a financial analyst. Gabby, do you have an opinion? I don't think she knows how it works either. So because selling these without any protection, which I'll get into in a moment, it has an infinite max loss, it's most common for a regular person to do this as part of a covered call strategy. So in my example with infinite maximum loss, you're basically trying to cover it with cash, right? So you end up paying the difference. But if instead you had 100 shares of Tesla and you sold somebody 100 or a call for 110 as a price, right? Then if it went to 1,000 before the option expired, before the call expired, you wouldn't lose all of that money. You would get that 100 shares taken away because I say you will have to buy, but if you already have the 100 shares, you've already bought them. So you're just selling the 100 shares for the price that your contract says that you would. So you're just basically liquidating your position, again, in my example of Tesla, to this person who held the call contract. So basically, instead of offering cash as collateral for this thing because your loss is infinite, you're offering your stock as collateral. And they call it a covered call because if Tesla stock were to drop some, your call would also drop in value. Right? It makes sense. You're drifting away from the value or the strike price of the call option that you sold. So you're kind of, in a way, covering your position in Tesla by selling a call that's a little bit of a ways above the current price. So hopefully that all made some sense. Because puts is a similar sort of concept, of course, right? Like selling a call was kind of the inverse of buying the call, but you had to care a little bit more about what the contract actually means and what the consequences are if you lose, basically. Whereas when you're the buyer and if you happen to win, you don't necessarily care what the consequences are because you may not be able to execute the contract anyway. So, selling puts, now you're selling the right to sell an underlying and blah, 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 blah. So, again, just like calls, this is kind of the inverse of buying a put. You don't want it to go down too far. You don't want it to get below that strike price of whatever your option is. If it does, now you have to buy 100 shares. That's because the contract holder that you sold your contract to has the right to sell 100 shares of that underlying asset. Therefore, as the person who wrote the contract, if the buyer executes that, you have to buy 100 shares from the seller. Oh, geez, that'll really mess a person up. You have to buy 100 shares from the buyer of your contract. You are the seller. Oh. So the maximum loss here is not actually infinity. The max loss is your strike price times 100 because the company could go inches from bankrupt and be worth a penny, right? Each share could be worth a penny. If it actually goes bankrupt, I'm not sure what happens. I think it might depend on the situation. If somebody knows, you're probably watching the wrong video, but also sound off in the comments. But so that's not quite your maximum loss because in selling this put, you also took in some amount of money on day zero, just like the call, right? You take in money the instant you sell it, and that's your maximum gain. So it's technically the maximum loss is strike price times 100 minus whatever you took in. So you can combine these things. What I was talking about before is oftentimes called naked calls or naked puts, meaning that there's no covering on them. There's no protection. Small swings in value of the underlying can create huge swings in your gain or loss. And that to a degree is also true with spreads. But you're capping your gain or loss at a known point with a spread. And a debit spread is basically just it's costing you money to get into. So you're buying you can see there, the call debit spread in the top left. You're buying an option that is closer to the current price, but above. In theory above. I guess you don't have to do it above. But you're buying a call option that is closer to the current price than the option you're selling. So what that means is it costs less to get into, right? Because you're buying and selling. But it still costs to get into because you're buying closer to the money, the current price, right? Uh, so that red range, still no profit. The yellow range, uh, somewhere in that yellow range, there will be a break-even point depending on how much this spread cost you to get into. But then from there, you're inching towards profit, and then you hit right at the boundary between yellow and green, you hit your maximum profit. Anywhere above green, because you also sold a call option at that boundary point, right? Strike price 2 sold, means that you're anywhere above that, you're not gaining more value. So you're capping your possible gain. And a reason you would do that is so that you don't have to spend as much to get into the option to begin with. There are a few reasons, but that's one of them. And I should say here, this terminology, call, debit spread, credit spread, strike price is pretty universal. Current price also pretty universal. But some of this stuff is a little bit, the exact terminology maybe depends a little on who you talk to. I'm just borrowing this terminology from the people who taught me about options that I've worked with. So, but some people I've met since then, when they just call it a spread, for example, a call spread without credit or debit, they mean credit. Some people say they bought or sold a spread, meaning they bought a debit spread, or they bought a spread and that means debit, or they sold a spread and that means credit. So I don't know if there's a completely correct answer or if it's one of those things where different regions have somewhat different terminology. If you feel as if you're getting lost or confused, make sure that you read your brokerage's terms to understand exactly what they're telling you. So, the next thing that I'll talk about is a put debit spread. Again, you're buying closer to the money and selling farther from the money. You can see it's a fairly similar concept, just on the opposite side of the calls. So, you, again, would do this because it lowers your initial price, but it does cap your maximum gain. And then there's the call credit spread. So this is another way that you can cap your maximum losses on a credit spread, or on a call, on selling a call option. This is one way you can cap your maximum loss, by buying a call option farther from the money, right? Because just like before, oh geez, I have those backwards. There, fixed. So, like I was saying, the call credit spread is basically you're selling a call but capping your max loss by buying something farther away from the current price. And that, well, can be useful for exactly that reason. And the put credit spread is somewhat similar in that you're capping your maximum loss by buying something, again, farther from the money. So you can see the amended profit ranges there as well, where green is your maximum gain and yellow is an increasing or decreasing gain as you get farther away from the current price, and the red is your maximum loss. Uh, so that is the general idea, I guess, behind some of the they're not really even moderate option strategies. It's really just basic strategies around how you can combine options to cap losses or cap gains but reduce your initial investment cost, things like that. And there's a variety of reasons and situations when to do or not do these things, and I'm just not going to get into that because, frankly, most people will never have a reason to care. So I'm going to do a follow-up video eventually that's a little bit deeper on some more advanced strategies. I'm not going to go totally crazy and really dig deep into like price estimations and what's referred to as the Greeks, which I think I talked about in a previous video as well. We're just going to talk about some other ways that you can combine options in a more creative fashion to make different types of bets on what the underlying asset will do. So I will see you guys in the next one.